Utilitarianism is associated with the 18th century political legislator and theorist Jeremy Bentham. Essentially, that we should act so as to maximize the happiness of the greatest number and minimize the suffering of the greatest number. Bentham himself, who kept a pig, didn't confine his attentions to humans. Quite rightly, he extended his ethic to non-human animals. There are many different flavors of utilitarianism, as well as classical utilitarianism, as I outlined it. There is preference utilitarianism, which focuses on maximizing preferences. There is also negative utilitarianism, which says essentially that we should prioritize minimizing suffering. And of the different flavors, it's negative utilitarianism that is my own particular focus. I think we have an overriding duty to minimize the amount of suffering in the world, and this takes precedence out over amplifying the well-being of the already happy. But it's worth stressing that one doesn't need to be any particular flavor of utilitarian or to hold any particular ethical belief system in order to endorse the abolitionist project. You can be a classical or preference utilitarian, you can be a deontologist, you can be a virtue theorist, you can be a Buddhist, you can be a Christian, you can be an ethical pluralist and still endorse phasing out the biology of involuntary suffering. All ethical systems we can think of have at least some counterintuitive consequences. One of the most counterintuitive implications of negative utilitarianism is apparently that if there were a button that one could press and would obliterate the whole of reality, then one should press it because that would get rid of all suffering. Now, for all sorts of reasons, I don't regard this as a compelling objection. For a start, of course, there is no button, and that if one is ethically serious about phasing out involuntary suffering, I think one should instead go down the biological route. But of the other brands of utilitarianism, classical utilitarianism is intuitively, at least, more natural. Indeed, if one wants to naturalize value, naturalization means making consistent with science, then in some ways classical utilitarianism is the most appealing, in that just as agony is, if you're in agony, self-intimatingly disvaluable, at least to the subject, likewise the experience of bliss is, if you are the subject, self-intimatingly valuable. Perhaps, unless you're interested, we won't go into too much detail there. I'd be delighted to do so. However, a disguised implication of a classical utilitarian ethic is also the obliteration of human life, because if one takes classical utilitarianism literally, we should be aiming to convert matter and energy into pure bliss, what one might call hedonium or utilitronium, and propagate utilitronium shockwave, essentially matter and energy optimized for pure bliss, but this shockwave propagating outwards at nearly the velocity of light. So yes, an extremely counterintuitive consequence of what might appear to be an almost commonsensical ethic. Yes, one can use different terms. They're not necessarily exactly equivalent. One can speak of pleasure plasma, hedonium, utilitronium. Whether utilitronium is technically the same as hedonium, one can argue the toss about, but it's worth stressing that if, like me, you are either a negative utilitarian or a Buddhist who thinks we should prioritize phasing out suffering, there is no sacred obligation to continue driving onwards to absolute maximum bliss. It's possible to believe we should enjoy life animated by gradients of intelligent bliss without being compelled in some sense to propagate uniform well-being indiscriminately outwards and everywhere. It's an option, but it would not be consistent with individual flourishing. We touched on preference utilitarianism. I'm not really convinced that the term preference utilitarianism is particularly useful in that in what sense is the satisfaction of preferences still a distinctively utilitarian theory? After all, so many of the preferences that people have will not actually make them happy. But yes, if one is a preference utilitarian, one believes that we should try to satisfy as many preferences as possible, with these preferences weighted for strength, depth, and other criteria like that. But it's worth, this might seem an obvious point, stressing that natural selection has given us a whole bunch of preferences which are not designed to make us happy, but essentially to help our genes leave more copies of themselves. A man, for example, may have an insatiable desire to sleep with as many women as possible, and his preferences for this rampant promiscuity will conflict with a desire of a woman, for example, to settle down with him and allow this powerful rich man to share the upkeep and care of their children. Now that's just one perhaps rather simplistic example, but yes, we have these whole host of conflicting desires and preferences as social primates and in the rest of the living world. Another example, a predator might have a strong desire to predate and eat his victim, whereas the member of the prey species will have a deep desire not to be eaten. These two preferences are mutually inconsistent. So preference utilitarianism, as you probably gathered, I have deep reservations about, but all of the utilitarian theories have counterintuitive implications.